Chapter 13. Ellie woke several hours later to find Rake and Fliss both still present and deep in discussion, their voices low. They didn't realize that she was awake until she sat up, feeling hungry, but there was already a pile of fruit beside her waiting. She picked up what looked like an apple, except it was bright pink with orange spots on. She held it, examining it for a moment before Fliss said,
"It's a comb apple. Try it. They're very sweet."
Ellie bit into it and found it to be juicy, sweet, and with a delicious tanginess to it that made Ellie want to devour it. So she did. Then another and another. Only after 4 did her hunger begin to feel sated, and she looked up with a sticky face coated in fruit juice to see the Tooth Fairy and Explorer Fairy staring at her, bemused. "It's easy to forget how young you are, Ellie, because you're so big and capable of such powerful magic. It's good to see you can still act your age," Rake said with a smile. Her hunger pains gone, the fruit making her feel energized, Ellie remembered her purpose. She stood up and told the two fairies,
"It's time I went to find Duncan. Can you tell me which way to go?"
Rake bit his lip and gave Fliss a searching look before he spoke. "Ellie, Fliss and I have been discussing things. First, we have to acknowledge that you are free to do as you desire, but the elders want you to stay, to help defend us and even help us fight back against the goblins and their army. They will try to keep you here, to convince you to stay, but Fliss thinks that, with their attack partly successful, since they took or destroyed nearly 2/3 of our stores of tooth dust, they will not attack again soon. She thinks that allowing the elders to keep you here would be a waste of your time. It might make the fairies here feel safer, but would achieve little. Perhaps your plan to go and rescue your brother is guided by the same fates that brought you here, to save us in the first place." Fliss watched her, unblinking, and nodding as Rake explained her reasoning. Then Rake added, "And if you're planning to go off on a dangerous adventure with or without us, I would feel better if it was with us. It will be dangerous, and you'll need help. So we have decided to accompany you, even guide you where we can, but we will have to go soon. If the elders find out, they will do everything they can to stop us." Ellie was amazed. She knew that these two fairies would be in trouble for going against the elders' wishes, and she had barely met Fliss, but they were both willing to help her. She was feeling both honoured and eager to go.
"I'm ready when you are."
Ellie saw Rake gulp when she said that, as if he hadn't really believed it would happen. Now they were agreed. They would go, possibly deep into Goblin lands, to find Duncan. Rake would be disgraced for leading the fairies' best protection away from them. Ellie felt bad, but she knew that she needed all the help she could get. Fliss floated into the air and started to give orders.
"We need to get some supplies. We'll need tooth dust where we're going, and it's more scarce than it has been in centuries."
She looked around warily.
"I'll get some. You grab some food. Ellie will need to carry it."
Then she darted away. Rake jumped down from the bush that he had perched in, and danced over to another bush that had large, long leaves. He reached his hands together and took a deep breath, and quietly said, perhaps to himself, "It's been a while since I did a bit of magic without any dust." He put his hands on the bush in front of himself, and closed his eyes, looking calm yet full of concentration. Ellie watched in fascination as the leaves of the bush began to weave themselves into something. They wove an intricate pattern, twisting around each other and themselves. They even seemed to fuse together in some places. Eventually it became a recognizable shape. The bush was forming itself into a bag, the perfect size for Ellie to carry over her shoulder. When the bag looked complete, the entirely organic object just separated from the bush, rolling to one side. But Rake wasn't finished. He still concentrated, and as Ellie crept closer she could see the tiniest bead of sweat forming on his face. The thin stems and branches of the bush, which had given up most of its leaves, were now forming new buds, which unravelled into tiny new leaves. Only then did Rake step back, satisfied with his work. "It should recover quickly," he informed her. Then he waved a hand towards the bag. "Try it on," he invited. She did, happily. It was, in every sense of the word, the most magical gift she had ever been given. It fit perfectly, was comfortable, and felt amazingly strong.
"Thank you. It's wonderful. What's it for?"
"Put the rest of the comb apples in it," he suggested. Ellie realised how obvious that should have been and hurried to do it. She had barely got them all in before Fliss was back, carrying 2 pouches. She landed next to Rake and handed him one. Rake raised an impressed eyebrow and said admiringly, "That was quick." "I'm very good at sneaking," admitted the Explorer Fairy. "It was one of the things I excelled at during my FIB Academy training." Then she looked Ellie up and down and asked, "Are we ready to go?" It seemed so abrupt. Ellie hadn't really done any preparation except to put some fruit in a bag, and she was about to set off on the most dangerous and important adventure of her life. But there wasn't really anything to prepare. She didn't own anything in this world except her wand, which she gripped tightly already. Her parents were a world away and under the influence of a spell that made them think she had gone on a school trip, so she didn't need to contact them.
I suppose so. Which way is it?
She asked, keen to set off.
This is it. I'm committed now. I'm coming, Duncan. I'm coming to save you and take you home.
It felt like a very significant moment in her life. It was ruined somewhat by the bemused smiles that the two fairies gave her. Fliss waved off to the right and said,
It's that way, I think, but we won't be walking. It would take over a week, even with your huge legs.
Ellie looked down. No one had ever described her legs as huge before, but the fairy's tiny statures would have reached barely past her ankles.
I'll make a portal. Rake, will you lend me a hand so we can save dust?
In answer, Rake hopped over to Fliss, who had landed gracefully, and offered a hand, which Fliss gripped. The two of them began to glow a little, and Ellie even thought she could see that glow pulsing, with tiny movements of the energy flowing from Rake to Fliss. Without warning, a tiny portal appeared, which then expanded steadily until it was large enough for Ellie to crawl through. Rake let go of Fliss's hand, and looked over his shoulder at his stunted wings with a grimace. He then turned his attention to Ellie. "Can I get a ride?" he asked, but didn't wait for her answer before he was nimbly climbing up her clothes to perch on her shoulder. Fliss hovered into the air and began to drift towards the portal. As Ellie took her first step, a voice sounded behind her. "Hey, where are you guys going?" the voice demanded. Ellie spun to see the source of the voice, worried that the newcomer would try to stop her from going. Her fast turn made Rake grip her hair tightly, pulling a strand of it painfully. Ellie heard Rake's sigh of relief when he saw the arrival of a fairy riding a pigeon. Both the pigeon and the fairy riding it suddenly seemed unsure of where to land, and the pigeon twisted mid-air and made an ungraceful landing between Ellie's feet, with the fairy flying free to skid in the dirt of the forest floor. Rake watched it all with unsurprised resignation, before greeting the dirt-covered fairy. "Hello, Blake," in an unimpressed tone. Fliss watched with an eyebrow raised, then asked,
You know each other?
"Yeah, this is Blake. He's my cousin and an apprentice tooth fairy," Rake answered to Fliss before he turned his attention to his cousin. "What are you doing here, Blake?" Well, the Tooth Fairy Academy is suspended, and I've been assigned to you for a field apprenticeship. So, here I am," the youthful fairy explained. Rake rolled his eyes at the news, but Blake's attention had turned to the glimmering portal. "Why have you created such a big portal? And where does it go?" he asked. Ellie looked around to see Fliss looking concerned. Rake answered in an easygoing and non-committal tone. "The portal's for Ellie. We're just going to show her a couple of the sights. We'll be back soon. I'll meet you at the Academy Great Tree," he told Blake, indicating that he should depart now. "Oh, no, I'm under strict orders from Perst. I'm not to leave your side until the current situation is over," the apprentice said. Rake responded quickly, beginning to seem flustered. "I'm sure she didn't mean it literally. I'll be back soon, and I'll meet you before—" Blake interrupted. "Perst seemed pretty clear. She told me to stick to you like honey. Those were her exact words, and she still hasn't forgiven me for that time I turned the leaf she was sleeping on into poison ivy. I swear I didn't know she was in there, and I don't want to do anything else to make her angry." Fliss was looking impatient, and it looked as if the portal was starting to contract a little.
"We need to go, so I guess he's coming with us,"
she said in a tone that suggested she questioned her own words.
"But don't bring the pigeon,"
she added. Blake bit his lip anxiously, but nodded and said, "Let's go." Fliss went through. With Rake on her shoulder, Ellie dropped to her knees and crawled through the portal, with Blake following closely. Ellie looked around, disorientated to no longer be surrounded by trees, but instead see grasslands, with pockets of trees around and mountains in the distance. The land was peaceful, and Ellie was admiring the beauty of it all, when it was disrupted by a pigeon bursting through the portal and crashing into her. Its second crash in as many minutes. Ellie fell to the ground with Rake and the pigeon forming a heap with her. Fliss had managed to gracefully dance clear of the mess, while Blake looked both surprised and guiltily responsible at seeing the clumsy bird follow them. Rake got up and growled, if the almost musical voice of a fairy could be said to make a growling noise, at his cousin. Blake, you were told not to bring the pigeon. But Blake just shrugged and responded, He's a pigeon, not a rock. He makes his own decisions. Then the apprentice hovered over to the pigeon and helped it to its feet, before climbing atop the bird's back. They both instantly looked happier and more comfortable than they had when separated. Where are we, anyway? Blake asked, looking at his surroundings with some confusion. Fliss looked unimpressed, but accepting of the events, which seemed to describe her general approach to life.
We are on the plains, near the Colossus Mountains. There's a Fablin town nearby. We're going to meet a Fablin town elder, she told them. Rake nodded. The plan seemed to be news to him too, but perhaps he had been expecting something like this. Ellie was as ignorant about it all as she was about everything else in this world. Blake looked astonished, and words sprung out of his mouth. Colossus Mountains? So, we're near Goblin lands? A Fablin town? I've never been to a Fablin town. Are we supposed to be here? Did the elders tell you to come here? Rake and Fliss ignored Blake. The explorer fairy took flight and began floating slowly towards the mountains to the east. Rake had climbed back onto Ellie's shoulder and Ellie began walking after Fliss. Frustrated by the lack of explanation, Blake launched into the air on his pigeon. What's a Fablin? Ellie asked Rake. Fablins and Gories are hybrids. Part fairy, part goblin. Fairy-goblin marriages are rare, so there are not that many, and it is difficult for them and their children to integrate with either race, so they tend to form their own towns near the border. Those on this side of the mountains are generally called Fablins, and tend to have more fairy in the mix. Those on the other side of the mountains are called Gories. The explanation was given as if to a small child, and reminded Ellie that even the very young here knew more about this world than she did. Each thing that Ellie learned made her more fascinated by the magical new world, and excited to discover the next enchanting secret.